So I think more than millennials and Gen Zs necessarily having transformed the way marketing is done today, the biggest driving factor I would say is the internet. Because it's really democratized knowledge and the way information spreads. And a few years ago, brands could get away with paying lip service to certain ideas or certain social issues or different kinds of stands that they would take. And by virtue of the internet, I don't think brands are able to do that anymore. So you really have to put your money where your mouth is. That's number one. Secondly, Gen Z and millennials in that sense, I think are a lot more, expressive about themselves. So if they find something that they are not comfortable with, whether it's, dissatisfaction with the service or whether it's, happiness with the service, I think they're very emphatic and expressive about it. So that means that the number of touch points in the consumer's life has gone up with the penetration of, say, social media, digital marketing, etc. And therefore, the number of touch points where you can disappoint or excite a consumer has gone up. So all of those things overall have impacted the way we market to consumers. And the third piece is really, if I look at the whole reaching out to consumers part of marketing specifically, right? Much like, say, the telephone during the baby boomers time, or say telegrams, for example, in an even earlier era. Today, the internet has offered consumers, or marketers for that matter, the ability to target and reach out to them in a very different way. So I don't know if you've seen this chart. It's a great chart that talks about, how long the telephone took to permeate a certain number of households vis-a-vis how long the internet took to permeate a certain number of households, right? And that's a great telling point of, how data is widely being used to reach out to consumers at a very micro level in terms of their behaviors, etc. So all of these things put together effectively means that I can't do 2 campaigns in a year today. I need to find a lot more reasons to be relevant in the consumer's life, which is very different to how marketing was done about, say, even 5 years ago, I think. One of the things that has stood good brands that in good stead, and they've managed to stand the test of time, is really finding their true north. And what I mean by that is, what is core to their brand, or what is core to that consumer experience that will always be there. So for example, say a Coca-Cola is about creating happiness in that sense, or Adidas in that sense, has a certain ethos. And I think finding what you stand for, if you identify that in today's day and time, automatically, your tribe will find you. Today consumers are not necessarily known as consumers. It's about finding your tribe, right? It's about fitting in with the people who relate to you in that sense. And if a brand is able to find out what its persona is, automatically people will start coming to it. So Lululemon, I think, is a great example in that sense. So, they started out with selling leggings, right? But over a period of time, it just turned into like an entire industry where, it soon went from, yoga pants to athleisure and all of that. And it just kind of exploded into an industry of its own. And that happened because they were very clear about what they wanted to sell. And I think in that regard, finding your essence, finding moments of truth that make sense to the consumer and are of consequence to the consumer's life is what helps communicate well with the generation of today, I think. The availability of data and information 24/7, of course, single-handedly has subverted everything in the world, right? From the way we eat to shop to travel, everything, right? So that, mobile devices, of course, as a consequence of the internet. And thirdly, but importantly, social networking platforms. And fourthly, also the kind of technologies, the ancillary technologies that have evolved, from these technologies, like, DMPs, AI tools, various marketing segmenting kind of devices, tools, etc., that marketers use today to reach out to consumers. So all of these put together have really changed the way marketing is done. I think the concept of a marketplace is not really new, right? The very word comes from a very ancient way of doing business. And in that time, it's also, and even in today's time, it's not necessarily just the technology or the idea that rules, the roost. And perhaps to some extent there is really no original idea. It's only, how well an idea is executed. So I don't think it is either or that, allows you to win in a marketplace. What's of paramount importance is how well you can own your consumer journey. So whenever the consumer is engaging with you, how well are you able to manage and control that experience? And if that experience for some reason does not match the consumer's expectations, how quickly are you able to win back that consumer? I think is the true test of how you can win in the marketplace, really. If I were to look at the word experience, right, when we experience something, it always leaves us with a certain feeling, right? And typically, human beings, as a tendency, always want something that is new and exciting. That's why we like novelty. That's why we always go out and try a new restaurant or a new location, new holiday spot, or technology, even for that matter. And I think that's where an experience that the consumer has to constantly keep pushing the ante in terms of reinventing itself, in terms of offering something that is new for the consumer, right? Whilst keeping in mind what works in the consumer's scheme of things. So a good example of that would be, as we look at the trends of the future, time is probably the most important currency as we go ahead. So as a marketer, as a brand, I think the number one question to ask ourselves would be, how can my experience of the brand improve, the consumer's life? How do I help him use his or her time better? In any sphere, it could be something as simple as, getting more bang for the buck when you do a 15-minute workout versus a 45-minute workout. It could mean getting, more calories in by drinking something rather than eating a full meal that may take much longer. So each person values a different set of experiences, but it is up to the brand to work out how to maximize that experience for the consumer depending on what the consumer values. So it could be time, it could be the experience itself, it could be many other aspects. So that would really be my response to that question. Each brand, especially brands with no history or heritage, they work in a really interesting space wherein, consumers have no expectations from them. So let's take Amazon, Apple, and then let's take GE as three examples, right? So if you look at Amazon, Amazon's been in business for a fairly long time now. However, the consumer experience on its own has evolved. It's basically, transformed over the last 5 years. And today, Amazon stands for one of those companies that consumers look to for, to benchmark themselves against in terms of putting the consumer first. And that has obviously evolved because of a certain customer centricity. Now, when you look at Apple, on the other hand, Apple stands for technology and giving you a great product. Consumer service, customer service, perhaps, to some extent, yes or no. So I think once you set the benchmark, you are not allowed to kind of falter from there. And of course, being human, businesses are run by human beings. How quickly do you recover from that experience or, that failed expectation, I think really separates the wheat from the chaff. And I think in that sense, for companies that are newer, it becomes that much easier to set the ground or the tone or the context in which they will be perceived. So I think Swiggy or Zomato, which are newer companies, are a great example of how they've set the benchmark for consumer experiences and expectations, vis-a-vis say an Uber and an Ola, how they've set the benchmark for consumer experiences and expectations. To stay ahead of the curve, I think a brand needs to do two things really, really efficiently. One is look outward constantly and understand what is relevant to the consumer. Why is my product or brand relevant to the consumer in the consumer's life cycle and the consumer's everyday? And then it also needs to look inward to see, in terms of the brand's journey, like while you're paying attention to the consumer's needs and wants, what part of it intersects with my own brand DNA. So if I were to take Coca-Cola, as in just the beverage on its own, so Coca-Cola makes an aerated beverage, right? However, today, say the trend is to drink healthier drinks, the trend is to drink, say, kombucha or green tea or whatever else it might be. Does that mean Coca-Cola on its own will stop making Coca-Cola? No. It just means that the parent company might evolve another brand, another business to kind of, tide that wave or, ride that wave in that sense. But Coca-Cola in that sense has continued to drive or keep going on that path. So how they've evolved, for example, is, now they make Diet Coke. They started an entire campaign to make sure that Diet Coke sells more, and they are perfectly okay with Diet Coke cannibalizing, their market share, at least perceptively, it seems that way. So I think it's a question of, constantly looking at what are the macro trends that are affecting the consumer and how can we intersect that and make products that are relevant while staying true to our own brand's DNA. I think for me, the first and foremost question that a brand needs to ask itself is, why do I exist? What is my purpose of existence, right? What need am I going to fulfill in the consumer's life? And once you've identified that, steering away from the tendency of let's do something that everyone else is doing. So typically brands have this tendency of saying, okay, everyone is doing, I don't know, say QR codes for argument's sake, or if they are doing bus shelters or something, right? There is a tendency of saying, okay, let's do this also from a marketing strategy standpoint, and then let's start building a brand or a product rather for the consumer that may or may not be true or relevant to the brand's positioning. So I think, being careful about what works for your brand and why you are here, and not getting carried away with let's join the cult. And I think the third piece is, finding those moments of truth where you are relevant to the consumer, and that keeps changing based on the kind of product that you sell or the category that you operate in. The moment of truth or the moment that a consumer needs you keeps changing. And as a marketer, I think it is my job to constantly keep finding reasons for the consumer to come back and say, hey, I need you. So I think for me, those would be the three secrets or, successes towards good brand building. If there's, X number of years of history of marketing and brands that has told us anything, it is that it does not. So I think that's a fairly emphatic answer in that sense. But a lot of it is also determined by the category that you operate in, right? So if, for example, I take FMCG, FMCG today still to some extent gets away by doing dubs or language edits, etc. in different markets, in different parts of the country, and different channels of marketing. So outdoor will have, whatever language text, etc. So that's one type of marketing that works or doesn't work depending on how you want to look at it. The other side is, again, if you are then in a super specialized category like soap. So there are brands like, say, a Hammam, for example, which is very, South dominant. So then they communicate in a certain way only to the southern part of the country, or Mysore for that matter, that again, Mysore soaps, that again communicates in a very specific way. If you take paints as a category, Kerala apparently dominates the country in terms of paint consumption. And so the reason paint companies do a separate campaign is because they paint their houses every year. So the way they approach Kerala on its own is very, very differentiated. So I think in that sense, a lot is governed by the category that you operate in. While of course, FMCG, where everyone has to wash their hair and brush their teeth, and therefore everyone by and large has the same challenges, has been somewhat insulated by the whole digital marketing and social media marketing wave, because it's a lot more massy in that sense. It's not that they don't use social and digital, but perhaps their point of persuasion is not necessarily social and digital. It's different compared to a lot of other categories. So the short answer is yes, you need differentiation. You need to have a very clear approach about why you are talking to different markets in a certain way, and most importantly, how you are communicating to them as well. Based on the category that you operate in. So brands should and can think local depending on each brand, their ethos, their strategy, and of course their footprint. So of course, if you operate in a certain part of the country and it dominates, your sales revenue in that sense, perhaps it might make sense to pay heed to the local festivals that come into play. Again, a lot of it is driven by the kind of categories that you operate in. So FMCG operates differently, electronics operates differently, apparel operates very, very differently. Therefore, I think the decision whether to go local or not, or to speak a certain way, depends on each brand, its ability to kind of create a balance between going hyper-local versus still staying true to its own brand identity and DNA. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach or an answer that necessarily can be put on the table and says that here's your answer, now go ahead and roll it out. So it's a very carefully thought through approach, and a lot of brands over the last several years have tried and tested different strategies to see what has worked. Sometimes it has worked very well for them. So for example, there are brands that have focused specifically on certain festive holidays in, say, the southern part of the country, whereas there are brands that have not done anything in the southern part specifically and done just as well. So I think a lot of it is determined by each business's own kind of environment and ecosystem. So we've just about started, looking into this whole ride between local festivals and maintaining an international approach. And we're just beginning to kind of discover how that would work. Of course, ParkAvenue has been around for over 3 decades. And every year, the consumer has evolved. Today, the consumer is no longer necessarily fixated on local festivals alone. They are global travelers. So I think it's a very careful balance that we need to come up with. And we're in the process of articulating that strategy, as it were. However, within apparel itself, there's a very strong set of festivals that a lot of local retailers follow and kind of try and build upon and use that to get the consumer into their stores fairly frequently if possible. And it's a strategy that works for different retailers to varying degrees of success. I think personalization still continues to some extent, overcoming the AI bias, especially within personalization. And the third but important piece is sustainability. So while of course marketing may not necessarily have a direct role to play in sustainability, I think a lot of brands are realizing the importance of how far the ramifications of sustainability are. And as a result, a lot of focus therefore comes on all parts of the value chain for a business. And I don't think marketing can be removed from that in that sense. A good example of that is, the way flexes were banned across the country. So I think that is only going to grow in terms of the kind of materials we consider, in terms of the channels that we look at, how we market to consumers, I think will become important. On trend, aspirational, and differentiated. The Touch of Care Wix campaign, the 1 million campaign, and I think that was a remarkable campaign because it had a great intersection in terms of driving brand purpose, but at the same time having a very emotionally strong storytelling moment. So that was one ad that I remember, going into the office and looking up on YouTube and sharing with colleagues and friends and saying, hey, you have to watch this campaign. In fact, even right now, as I'm talking about it, I get gooseflesh because I think it's a very, very well told story that marries brand purpose and brand communication really well. So I think that would be the one campaign.